Hello everyone and welcome to Archaea Viking. This is the first of two videos I'm doing for this year's holiday of Juneteenth. The subject of this video is the Amistad Rebellion in the 19th century Atlantic world. Now, right off the bat, I'm sure a lot of people watching this video who grew up in the 90s and the late 80s, etc., when you hear the phrase Amistad, you think of the movie uh, produced by Steven Spielberg, starring people like Morgan Freeman, Anthony Hopkins, Jimon Honsu, and Matthew McConaughey. And to be fair, the movie is about what this video is about, to a point. Of course, it's a movie that's very much dramatized. Um, and admittedly, I have not seen the movie, so I don't know how much of it is dramatized and how much of it is accurate. But regardless, knowing Steven Spielberg, there's a good chance, uh, a large bit of it is dramatized, or at least had liberties taken with it. So, with that in mind, we're going to, in this video, explore the actual history of the Amistad Rebellion. Now, one thing we need to do real quick is sort of define what I mean by the Atlantic world. So the Atlantic world, in sort of its broadest sense, was the interactions among the peoples and empires bordering along the Atlantic Ocean rim from the beginning of the Age of Discovery in 1450 CE, all the way up into the early 1800s CE. The main empires that built the Atlantic world were the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, and the United States of America, with smaller empires being involved in the Atlantic world, including the Swedish Empire and the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway. Um, also, um, uh, in addition to the great European empires, other key empires and kingdoms that played a part in the construction of the Atlantic world were West African empires such as the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Kingdom of Congo, the Ashanti Empire, among others, all of which played, again, integral roles in reshaping the Atlantic world, in shaping the Atlantic world itself. And then the Atlantic world itself was predominantly built around the transatlantic slave trade. Excuse me, where Africans were captured and then sold into enslavement in European colonies such as Cuba and Jamaica, and in the southern states in the United States, such as my home state of Georgia. And here's a broad list of sources that you can consult and learn more about the Atlantic world. I will include them all in the citations of this video. And here's a map of that Atlantic world, specifically of the what is known as mercantilism, or the sort of trade um, system and economic system that existed during this time, also known as the triangular trade, that was a predecessor to modern day capitalism. And you can see again all the various goods that they traded back and forth. And you'll notice a key factor in here, enslaved individuals right here. And that's because, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, again, as I already mentioned, was a key part of the Atlantic world. And here's a map of some of the sort of broad players in the Atlantic world, the United States, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, etc. And here's a map of West Africa during the 1830s and 1840s at the time of the Amistad Rebellion. And again, you can see here the Ashanti Empire, Dahomey, etc., among many others. As well as the Kingdom of Congo, which was down in West Central Africa. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the prelude to the Amistad Rebellion. So, uh, starting in 1807 CE, the British Empire would outlaw the transatlantic slave trade with the Slave Trade Act of 1807 CE. And then the United States would shortly after follow suit and outlaw the transatlantic slave trade with the an act that was known as the Act of Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, which was signed into law on January 1st, 1808 CE. And then on September 1817 CE, the British Empire and the Spanish Empire, seen here and here, would enter into a treaty prohibiting the transatlantic slave trade above the equator. However, despite multiple bans on the transatlantic slave trade, multiple empires such as the United States and the Spanish Empire would continue to import enslaved Africans from Africa. Which brings us to the impetus that led to the Amistad Rebellion, which is where two Spanish plantation owners, Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montez, in Havana, Cuba, would purchase 53 captured Africans who were predominantly from the West African Mende culture. They would then load the 53 Mende onto the ship La Amistad, the Amistad, with the intent of taking them to plantations in Puerto Principe, modern Camagüey, Cuba. And they would do this on June 28th, 1839 CE. This brings us to our next section where we need to sort of go over who the Mende people are. So the Mende people are one of the two largest ethnic groups in Sierra Leone in West Africa, or in the region that would eventually become known as Sierra Leone, and also still now in Sierra Leone as well. Uh, West African society in the 1800s was generally in the 1800s CE was generally patrilineal, meaning they had a common kinship in which their family membership was derived from and recorded through their father's lineage, and their society was patrilocal, which means is a social system in which married couples reside with or near the husband's parents. Polygamy was also common, especially among the wealthy men in West Africa, with wealthy men having many wives. That being said, women did hold important roles and still do hold important roles in West African society, especially in the management of agricultural practices such as the harvesting and threshing of rice. Warfare is, and in many ways still is, endemic in West Africa, with West African and European empires competing for territory and raiding smaller West African communities to capture prisoners to sell into enslavement. Traditional West African warfare consisted of hit and run raids, small scale attacks, and night attacks. Fortifications were common, and at the center of each town was a war village where warriors and weapons were always at the ready. Leadership in West African communities was often earned through skill in warfare and economical skill rather than being inherited. West African communities were also often and are often governed by secret societies. I do want to preface this by saying not the same secret society, type of secret society, such as like say the Illuminati or Hydra or any other uh, supposed secret society that conspiracy theorists love to go to. It's more like a secret society, like say the Freemasons. We know they're there, and they're not, you know, outwardly trying to destroy the world or anything like that. They just have certain rituals that we don't know everything about, and that's fine. So, with that in mind, some of these secret societies include, but are not limited to, the Poro Society, which was a secret society for West African men that established laws, and I believe still in many ways establishes laws, maintained order, held the authority to issue capital punishment. They would make decisions about war in tandem with kings, chiefs, and war leaders. They would prepare men for leadership in the community, among other duties. And the greatest sins a Mende man could commit was to give away the secrets of their tribe. Then, in contrast to this, there's the Sunday Society, which was and still is a society for West African women. The goals of the secret society were, and I believe still are, to teach young Mende women the responsibilities of adulthood. The girls were then taught to be hardworking and modest in their behavior, especially towards their elder Sunday influences. um, the elders Sunday the elders and the Sunday influences every aspect of a Mende woman's life. Um, this influence was present before birth and still present after. The Sunday Society was and I believe still is concerned with defining what is to be human and with discovering the ways of promoting love, justice, and harmony. And it was a moral philosophy that focused on the perpetual refinement of the individual. Now, I will say, obviously, there's only so much information I can learn about this. So, if there's anybody from West Africa, from Sierra Leone, who knows more about this, please feel free to correct me or provide more information or etc. As you feel comfortable. Uh, then finally, the dominant religions in West Africa, in West African society, were and still are Islam and Catholic Christianity, as well as traditional West African polytheism. In fact, often West African communities would and still do syncretize Islamic and Christian practices with traditional West African polytheism to produce various hybrid religions. And here's a picture of some West African warriors. Here's some more. And here's some more here. These are actually some of the Dahomey soldiers. And so some of the weapons that they would use include things like spears, various types of swords. Uh, they would have various fabric and hide shields and war sticks, spears, like similar to spears or, say, quarterstaffs. And then, of course, some elite West African soldiers were equipped with the some of the top of the line modern firearms that existed at the time, such as the British Snider Enfield rifles. Though, uh, admittedly, most of West African soldiers were equipped with Napoleonic era French smoothbore muskets. And here's an example of the Poro Society, and here's an example of the Sunday Society. And then here's an example of the Great Mosque of Jenne, an example of Islam in West Africa, and here's an example of a traditional West African polytheistic ceremony. All right, now this brings us to the one of the main sections of the video, the Amistad Rebellion itself. So, the crew of the Amistad, lacking purpose, built quarters for enslaved Africans, placed half the captured Africans in the main hold and the other half on deck. This would provide the West Africans with relative freedom to move about. Several West Africans, led by Singbe Pie, later known as Joseph Sinke, um, would they this group led by Joseph Sinke PA would use their experience in subterfuge and secrecy from their time in the Poro Society to plan a rebellion. And they would do this between June 28th and July 1st, 1839 CE. After finding a rusty file, the captives would then break free of their shackles and arm themselves with machete-like cane knives. The West Africans would use their experience in West African warfare to quickly overwhelm the Spanish crew and take over the ship. Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montez, the two alleged owners of the West Africans, were spared so that they could guide the ship back to Africa. And this would happen on July 1st, 1839 CE. Uh, However, while the West Africans demanded to be returned home, Montez would deceive them about their course and would maneuver the ship along the North American coast until they reached the eastern tip of Long Island, New York, with this happening between July 1st and August 21st of 1839 CE. La Amistad would then be discovered 30 miles south of Sandy Hook, New Jersey, by multiple New York pilot boats. Some of the boats would supply La Amistad with bread and water. However, one pilot boat would become suspicious and report La Amistad to the United States authorities under suspicion of being a slave ship. And this would happen on August 21st, 1839 CE. La Amistad was initially able to evade United States authorities. However, they were eventually discovered and captured by the United States naval brig, the USS Washington. La Amistad would then be taken to the Long Island Sound port of New London, Connecticut on August 26, 1839 CE. Now this brings us to the next main part of the video, the United States versus the Amistad, starting with the early court proceedings. So, Lieutenant Thomas R. Gedney, the commander of the USS Washington, hoped to profit from the sale of the West Africans and the transfers, and would then transfer the captured West Africans into the custody of the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut, where legal proceedings would then begin. And this would happen towards the end of August 1839 CE. And this would have a variety of different people making claims and filing suits. Starting with, of course, Lieutenant Thomas R. Gidney, who would file a libel, a lawsuit in admiralty law, for salvage rights to the West African captives and cargo on board La Amistad as property seized on high seas. Henry Green and Palatia Fordham would file a libel for salvage and claim they had been the first to discover La Amistad. Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montez would file libels requesting their property of slaves and cargo to be returned to them. The Office of the United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut, representing the Spanish government, would libel for the slaves, cargo, and vessel to be returned to Spain as its property. Antonio Vega, Vice Consul of Spain, was then liable for the slave Antonio on the grounds that the man was his personal property. The Africans would deny that they were slaves or property and would argue that they could not return them to the control of the government of Spain. And then Jose Antonio Telenicus with Aspe and Laka would claim other goods on board La Amistad. And here's the source I got this information from. The British would then consider it a matter of international law for the United States to release the West Africans. The British, in fact, would apply diplomatic pressure to achieve that, such as invoking the Treaty of Ghent with the United States, which jointly enforced their respective prohibitions against the international slave trade. And then Richard Robert Madden, would arrive in the United States on behalf of the British Commission to suppress the transatlantic slave trade in Havana, Cuba, and would testify that the West Africans were illegally imported and enslaved in violation of the treaty between the British Empire and the Spanish Empire. Madden would later then have an audience with Queen Victoria concerning the case, with all this happening in 1840 CE. Madden would then confer with Henry Stephen Fox, the British minister in Washington, D.C., who would then pressure the United States Secretary of State, John Forsyth, on behalf of the British Empire. And he would do this specifically on January 20th, 1841 CE. And in fact, we have an excerpt of Fox's deposition that reads, and I quote, Great Britain is also bound to remember the law of Spain. That the law of Spain, which finally prohibited the slave trade throughout the Spanish dominions from the date of the 30th of May, 1820, the provisions of which law are contained in the King of Spain's royal cedula of the 19th December. Was passed in compliance with a treaty obligation to that effect by which the Crown of Spain had bound itself to the Crown of Britain, for which a valuable compensation and return was given by Great Britain to Spain. As may be seen by reference to the second, third, and fourth articles of the public treaty concluded between Great Britain and Spain on the 23rd of September, 1817. It is next to be observed that Great Britain and the United States have mutually engaged themselves to each other by the 10th article of the Treaty of Ghent to use their best endeavors for the entire abolition of the African slave trade, and there cannot be no doubt of the firm intention of both parties religiously to fulfill the terms of that engagement. Now, the unfortunate Africans whose case is the subject of the present representation have been thrown by accidental circumstances into the hands of the authorities of the United States government. Whether these persons shall receive the freedom to which they are entitled, or whether they shall be reduced to slavery in violation of known laws and contracts publicly passed, prohibiting the continuance of the African slave trade by Spanish subjects. It is under these circumstances that Her Majesty's government anxiously hope that the President of the United States will find himself empowered to take such measures in behalf of the aforesaid Africans as shall secure them the possessions of their liberty to which, without doubt, they are by law entitled. And here's where I got that excerpt from. John Forsyth would then respond that under the separation of powers in the United States Constitution, the president could not and cannot influence the court case, as the question of whether or not the West Africans had been enslaved in violation of the treaty was still open. He then suggested that if the court found for the Spanish rights of property, that the West Africans would be returned to Cuba. The British Empire and the Spanish Empire could then argue their questions of law and treaties between them. Forsyth would then request from the Spanish minister, Chevalier de Argaiz, quote, a copy of the laws now in force in the island of Cuba relative to slavery. In response, the Captain General of Cuba sent Argaiz everything on the subject since the 1818 CE treaty between Spain and England had been signed. The minister also expressed dismay that the West Africans had not already been returned to Spanish control, and that also the Spanish maintained that none but the Spanish court could have jurisdiction over the case. Furthermore, the Spanish officials claimed that just as the United States had ended its importation of enslaved Africans but maintained a legal domestic population, so too had Cuba. The Spaniards then went on to point out that by American law, the jurisdiction over, quote, over a, quote, vessel on the high seas in time of peace engaged in a lawful voyage is according to the laws of nations under the exclusive jurisdiction of the state to which her flag belongs, as much so as if constituting a part of its own domain. If such a ship or a vessel should be forced by stress of weather or other unavoidable cause into the port and under the jurisdiction of a friendly power, she and her cargo and persons on board, with their property and all the rights belonging to their personal relations as established by the laws of the state to which they belong, would be placed under the protection which the laws of nations extend to the unfortunate nation under such circumstances. And here's the source that I got this information from. The Spanish officials would go on to categorize the West Africans as property to have the case fall under Pekingese Treaty of 1795 CE, specifically Article 9, which states that any ship and its contents rescued by pirates should be returned to a port belonging to either the United States or the Spanish Empire. Upon arrival at the port, the rescued property was to be delivered, and I believe to some degree is still to be delivered to the custody of the officers of that port. These officials would then be responsible for taking care of the property and restoring it in its entirety to the rightful owner as soon as sufficient proof of ownership was established. By insisting that the case fell under the treaty, the Spanish were invoking the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, which would put the clauses of the treaty above the state laws of Connecticut or New York, where the ship had been taken into custody. The Spanish also hoped to avoid talking about the law of nations, as some of their opponents argued that it included a duty by the United States to treat West Africans with the same deference as would be accorded any other foreign sailors. However, at this point, the case had already risen out of the state's courts into the federal district court sometime in 1840 CE. Uh, Also, during this period of time, the West Africans would begin to garner a lot of abolitionist support. So, this would come in the form of what is known as the Amistad Committee, which was a committee formed by the abolitionist movement that was headed by the New York City merchant Lewis Tappan. And also, the abolitionist movement began to collect money to mount a defense of the West Africans. The abolitionists would then go on to file charges of assault, kidnapping, and false imprisonment against Ruiz and Montez, who would then be arrested, and then their arrests in New York City in October 1839 CE would actually outrage pro-African chattel slavery advocates such as John C. Calhoun, as well as, unsurprisingly, the Spanish government. All of the parties would then all the parties with the Spanish minister representing Ruiz and Montez would then appear before the United States District Court, specifically for the District of Connecticut, and they would present their argument. The abolitionists' main argument before the district court was that the treaty signed between Britain and Spain in 1817 CE and subsequent pronouncement of the Spanish government had outlawed pronouncement by the Spanish government had outlawed the African slave trade across the Atlantic. And they would also go on to establish that the enslaved West Africans had been captured in Mende land, what is now modern day Sierra Leone, in West Africa, and then they were then sold to a Portuguese trader in Lomboko, south of Freetown, in April of 1839 CE, and then were taken to Havana illegally on a Portuguese ship, and therefore the West Africans were victims of illegal kidnapping, and so therefore were not enslaved and were free to return to Africa. And the abolitionists would make this argument on January 7th, 1840 CE. On top of this, the abolitionists would enlist James Covey, a formerly enslaved sailor who could speak the Mende language, to help the West Africans, to help communicate with the West Africans. With Covey's help, Professor J.W. Gibbs would actually learn from the West Africans to count to 10 in their Mende language. Covey would also translate the testimonies of 3 of the Mende captives in the Amistad civil trial in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1841 CE. Later on in 1841 CE. Because of his own experience, Covey was instrumental in interpreting and communicating the details of the kidnapping, terror, and eventual rebellion. In fact, translated testimonies from the West Africans participating in the mutiny revealed that the cook of the Amistad taunted the captives and told them that the crew intended to kill and eat the prisoners. Knowing this motive was crucial in understanding that the captives acted in self-defense. And all this would happen between October 1839 and 1841 CE. Now, you note the date 1841 CE versus the dates that we just saw that were in 1840 CE. That will be explained in a little bit later in the video. Now, first we need to go to the district court's decision. So, concerned about the relations with the Spanish Empire as well as his re-election prospects in the southern United States, United States President Martin Van Buren would actually side with the Spanish Empire's position and would order the schooner, the USS Grampus, to New Haven Harbor to return the West Africans to Cuba immediately after what he assumed was going to be a favorable court decision, before any appeals could be decided. And this would happen between November and December 1839 CE. So, pretty much immediately as all these trials began happening. However, contrary to Van Buren's plan, the district court ruled in favor of the abolitionists and the West Africans' position. The court would then order for the West Africans to be returned to their homeland by the United States government, and for one-third of La Amistad and its cargo to be given to Lieutenant Gedney as salvage property. The one exception was Antonio, the deceased captain's personal enslaved African, who was declared to be the rightful property of the captain's heirs and was ordered to return to Cuba. However, unsurprisingly, Antonio escaped to either New York or Canada with the help of an abolitionist group. And this decision would happen in January of 1840 CE. The district court ruled as follows. It rejected the claim of the United States attorney who argued on behalf of the Spanish minister for the restoration of the slaves. It dismissed the claims of Ruiz and Montez. It ordered that the captives be delivered to the custody of the United States president for transportation to West Africa, since they were in fact legally free. And it allowed the Spanish vice consul to claim the enslaved Antonio. It then also allowed Lieutenant Gedney to claim one-third of the property on board of La Amistad. It allowed Telemachus, Espe, and Laka or Lhasa, I apologize if I butchered those, to claim one-third of the property. And it dismissed the claims made by Green and Fordham for salvage rights. And here is the source I got this from. The United States, however, despite this, the United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut, by order of Van Buren, immediately appealed the United States Circuit Court for the Connecticut District. He challenged every part of the district court's ruling except the concession of the enslaved Antonio to the Spanish vice consul. Telemachus, Espe, and Lhasa also appealed to gain a greater portion of the salvage value. Ruiz and Montez, the owners of La Amistad, did not appeal. And all this happened between January and April of 1840 CE. The Circuit Court of Appeals, in turn, would uphold the district court's decision, and then the United States Attorney would appeal the federal government's case to the United States Supreme Court. So, as you can see, going back to the abolitionist part with Covey's translation of the testimonies, as you can see, these trials extended well past 1840 and into 1841, which actually brings us to our next section, arguments before the Supreme Court. So, United States Attorney General Henry D. Gilpin would begin the oral argument phase before the Supreme Court. Gilpin would first enter evidence of the papers of La Amistad, which stated that the West Africans were Spanish property. Gilpin argued that the court had no authority to rule against the validity of the documents, and Gilpin contended that if the West Africans were enslaved as indicated by the documents, that they must be returned to the rightful owner, the Spanish government. Gilpin's argument lasted 2 hours, and this would happen on February 22nd, 1841 CE. In contrast, John Quincy Adams, former President John Quincy Adams, and U.S. politician and attorney Roger Sherman Baldwin would represent the West Africans. Baldwin would open their arguments by contending that the Spanish government was trying to manipulate the court to return fugitives. He would also argue that the Spanish government was seeking the return of enslaved Africans who had been freed by the district court, but was strangely not appealing the fact of their having been freed. Covering all the facts of the case, Baldwin spoke for 4 hours over the course of 2 days, with this happening between February 22nd and 23rd of 1841 CE. Adams would then rise to speak and remind the court that it was part of the judicial branch and not part of the executive branch, with this happening on February 24th, 1841 CE. In fact, Adams would introduce copies of correspondence between the Spanish government and the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, with him specifically criticizing President Van Buren for his assumption of unconstitutional powers in the case, with Adams stating, and I quote, "This review of all the proceedings of the executive I have made with utmost pain, because it was necessary to bring it fully before your honors, to show that the course of the department had been dictated throughout, but not by justice, but by sympathy, and sympathy the most partial and unjust. And this sympathy prevailed to such a degree among all persons concerned in this business as to have perverted their minds with regard to all the most sacred principles of the law and right on which the liberties of the United States are founded. And a course was pursued from the beginning to the end, which was not only an outrage upon the persons whose lives and liberties were at stake, but hostile to the power and independence of the judiciary itself. And here is the source that I got, Adams' oral arguments. Adams would then further argue that neither Piccaninny's Treaty nor the Adams-Onis Treaty applied to the case. And he also stated that Article 9 of Piccaninny's Treaty refers only to property and did not and still does not apply to people. And with these arguments being made by Adams between February 24th and March 1st of 1841 CE. The Supreme Court would then rule that Article 9 of Piccaninny's Treaty was not applicable, was inapplicable, so therefore not applicable, since the West Africans in question had never been legal property and were not criminals, as the United States Attorney's Office had argued, but rather unlawfully kidnapped and forcibly and wrongfully carried on board La Amistad. The documents submitted by Attorney General Gilpin were evidence not of property, but rather of fraud on the part of the Spanish government. Lieutenant Gedney and the USS Washington were to be awarded salvage from the vessel. The court further stated that when La Amistad anchored near Long Island, it was in the possession of West Africans on board who had never intended to be enslaved. Therefore, the Adams-Onis Treaty did not apply, and so the president was not required by that law to cover the expense of returning the West Africans to Africa. And the Supreme Court made this decision on March 9th, 1841 CE. In fact, Associate Justice Joseph Story would deliver the court's decision, with Story writing in his judgment that, quote, "It is also a most important consideration in the present case, which ought not to be lost sight of, that supposing these African Negroes not be slaves, but kidnapped and free Negroes, the treaty with Spain cannot be obligatory upon them, and the United States are bound to respect their rights as much as those of Spanish subjects. The conflict of rights between the parties under such circumstances becomes positive and inevitable, and must be decided upon the eternal principles of justice and international law. If the contest were about any goods on board of the ship to which American citizens asserted a title which was denied by the Spanish claimants, there could be no doubt of the right to such American citizens to litigate their claims before any competent American tribunal, notwithstanding the treaty with Spain. Fortiori, the doctrine must apply where human life and human liberty are in issue, and constitute the very essence of this controversy. The treaty with Spain could never have intended to take away the equal rights of all foreigners who should contest their claims before any of our courts to equal justice, or to deprive such foreigners of the protection given to them by other treaties, or by the general law of nations, upon the merits of the case. Then there does not seem to us be any ground for doubt that these Negroes ought to be deemed free, and that the Spanish treaty interposes no obstacle to the just assertion of their rights. When the Amistad arrived, she was in possession of the Negroes, asserting their freedom, and in no sense could they possibly intend to import themselves here as slaves or for sale as slaves. In this view of the matter, the part of the decree of the district court is unmaintainable and must be reversed. That part of the decree of the district court is unmaintainable and must be reversed. The view which has been thus been taken for this case upon the merits under the first point renders it wholly unnecessary for us to give any opinion to the other point as to the rights of the United States to intervene in this case in the manner already stated, We dismiss this, therefore, as well as several minor points made at the argument. Upon the whole, our opinion is that the decree of the circuit court affirming that of the district court ought to be affirmed, except so far as it directs the Negroes to be delivered to the president to be transported to Africa, in pursuance of the act of the 3rd of March, 1819. As to this, it ought to be reversed, and that said, the Negroes be declared to be free and be dismissed from the custody of the court and go without delay. And here is the source that I got this decision delivered by Associate Justice Joseph. Now, this brings us to our last section, the aftermath of the United States versus the Amistad. So, first off, the West Africans would understandably, would greet the news of the Supreme Court's decision with joy, and then abolitionist supporters would take the survivors, 36 men, boys, and 3 girls. Several had died, unfortunately, in the Atlantic Ocean, and then some had died in custody. And they would take these survivors to Farmington, a village considered Grand Central Station on the Underground Railroad, because its residents had agreed to have the West Africans stay there until they could return to their homeland. Some households would take them in, and supporters would also provide barracks for them. And then between November 1841 and April 1842 CE, the United States would deal with another ship rebellion similar to that of La Amistad in the Creole case, where 128 enslaved Africans seized the United States ship, the Creole, and would successfully sell it to the British Bahamas, where African chattel slavery had been abolished. Later, 19 of the rebels would then be imprisoned by the United States on charges of mutiny. An Admiralty court hearing would then rule that the men had been illegally held as captives, as enslaved individuals, and had the rights to use force to gain freedom. The 17 men, 2 of the prisoners having died in the interim, were then released and given their freedom. And then in 1842 CE, along with several missionaries, the West Africans would return to Sierra Leone. And then the white American missionaries, would construct a mission in Mende land. And then former members of the Amistad Committee would later found the American Missionary Association, an integrated evangelical organization that continued to support both the Mende mission and the abolitionist movement. In the following years, between 1845 and 1861 CE, the Spanish government would continue to press the United States for compensation for the ship, cargo, and enslaved West Africans. Several lawmakers from the southern United States would introduce resolutions into the United States Congress to appropriate money for such payments, but the resolutions did not pass, although they were supported by President James K. Polk and James Buchanan. Hence, why this happened between 1845 and 1861 CE. And then another important thing to point out is the United States versus the Amistad was the most important court case involving African chattel slavery before being eclipsed by the Dred Scott versus Sanford case in 1857 CE. And then Singbe PA, Joseph Sinke, would return to West Africa, and in his final years, he is reported to have returned to the mission and re-embraced Christianity. And with that, that ends our first video for this year's Juneteenth holiday. I really hope all of you watching, enjoyed the video and learned a lot. It's not often when talking about rebellions by enslaved Africans and African Americans that you have what you could call a happy ending. Oftentimes, rebellions by enslaved Africans and African Americans ended in disaster. But as a lot of historians on the subject like to point out, whether they succeeded or failed, the simple fact that these rebellions by enslaved Africans and African Americans happened attest to just how horrible African chattel slavery was, and also attest to the lengths that enslaved Africans and African Americans were willing to go to gain their freedom. And in this case, they succeeded. So with that, again, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you would like to see me cover any of the videos I discussed, any of the things I discussed in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.